Raymond Kessler stood in the International Harvester showroom in 1968, staring at a machine that would determine his entire future. The new Farmall 656 gleamed under fluorescent lights, priced at $8,200. He earned $12,000 a year. The dealer smiled, offering 5% financing over 5 years. Raymond's hand touched the cold metal, then he walked out. He had no idea that this single decision would save him from losing everything while his neighbors went bankrupt one by one. But before we get to the catastrophe that destroyed half the farms in Illinois, you need to understand what was building in 1973. Spring arrived late that year in Gibson City. The ground stayed frozen weeks longer than normal, and when it finally thawed, it turned into a death trap. Raymond owned 480 acres his grandfather had broken with horses in 1891. No mortgage, no equipment loans, zero debt. His neighbors knew this, and they whispered about it at the feed mill. Raymond still pulled his plows with a 1948 Farmall M that leaked oil, backfired every morning, and looked like someone painted it with a brush. The tractor was 25 years old, in an era when farmers were buying new iron every 5 years. The younger farmers made jokes, quiet jokes, but loud enough. They said Raymond was too cheap to upgrade. They said he was stuck in 1950. They wondered how long a man could survive on old equipment and older ideas. What they didn't know was that Raymond had done the math 5 years earlier. That $8,200 tractor at 5% meant he'd pay nearly $10,000 total. Money that wouldn't be earning anything. Money that wouldn't be buying land when someone decided to sell. So he told his wife Doris, "I'd rather fix what I have than owe what I don't." Now in 1973, everything was about to prove him right or destroy him completely. Corn prices had been climbing since late 1972. A massive grain sale to the Soviet Union. Crop failures worldwide. By spring of '73, corn was trading at $260 a bushel, more than double what it had been 2 years earlier. Suddenly, there was real money in farming, the kind of money people had been waiting for since World War II ended. And with that money came confidence. And with confidence came spending. New tractors, bigger planters, more land. The younger farmers saw this as their moment. They were ordering equipment they wouldn't take delivery on until next year, convinced that prices would keep climbing, convinced that debt was just leverage in disguise. Raymond's neighbor Tom Hoffetter bought 200 more acres that April, paid $475 an acre for land that had been worth $250 3 years earlier, financed the whole purchase at 7.2%, then bought a new 4-wheel drive tractor to work the extra ground. That tractor cost $18,000. Tom was 34 years old. He'd inherited a small operation and had been expanding aggressively since 1969. By spring of '73, Tom was farming nearly 900 acres, but he didn't own most of it. He owed money on land, owed money on equipment, owed money on operating loans for seed and fertilizer and fuel. His annual debt service was running close to $30,000. But Tom wasn't worried. Not with corn at $260. He told people he was building an operation that would support his family for generations. Then the rain came. Not normal rain, biblical rain. It started the first week of May and didn't stop for 3 weeks. The fields turned to soup. Tractors sank to their axles. Planting dates slipped from mid-May to late May to early June. Some farmers, desperate to get their crops in, pushed their equipment into fields that weren't ready. They got stuck. They called for help. They got stuck again. Men who'd bought the biggest, newest, most powerful machines available were watching them disappear into the mud while their planting windows closed and their loan payments came due regardless. Raymond waited. His Farmall M sat in the shed while the rain fell. Doris asked him twice if he was going to try. Both times he said no. He said the ground would tell him when it was ready. His neighbors didn't wait. Tom Hoffeter was out there the last week of May with his new four-wheel drive, trying to get his beans planted. He made it halfway across his Northwest 40 before the tractor started sinking. Front wheels dug in first, then the rears. Tom tried to back out. The mud held him. He radioed for help. 2 other farmers brought their tractors over to pull him free. They hooked chains to the frame and pulled. Nothing. They repositioned and pulled again. Still nothing. The big four-wheel drive was buried up to its differential. $18,000 of steel and debt, sitting motionless in a field that was supposed to make Tom's future. Word spread fast. By that evening, half the farmers in the township knew Tom Hoffeter was stuck. Some came out to help, bringing their own tractors, their own chains, their own ideas. They pulled for hours. They tried winches. They tried digging. They tried everything except waiting for the ground to dry, because there wasn't time to wait. Every day lost was yield lost. And yield was money, and money was how you paid back the bank. By the time the sun went down, they'd managed to free one of the tractors that had gotten stuck trying to pull Tom out. But Tom's four-wheel drive was still there. And now there was a second machine beside it, a neighbor's combine that had been brought in as a heavy anchor and had promptly sunk into the same mud. That's when someone said they should call Raymond Kessler. It was almost a joke at first. Someone laughed and said maybe Raymond's old Farmall could do what $20,000 worth of modern equipment couldn't. But Tom was desperate enough to try anything. So he drove to Raymond's farm just after dark and knocked on the door. Raymond listened to the story, nodded, and said he'd come take a look in the morning. Tom asked if Raymond thought he could help. Raymond said he didn't know, but he'd bring his tractor. The next morning, Raymond drove his Farmall M out to Tom's field. A small crowd had gathered by then, maybe a dozen farmers, all standing around the 2 stuck machines like they were viewing a body. Raymond walked the field first, testing the ground with his boots, checking the consistency, looking at the angle of the slope and the way the water had settled. Then he went back to his tractor, backed it up to a spot about 40 feet from Tom's four-wheel drive, and started letting air out of his rear tires. He dropped the pressure down to about 8 pounds per square inch, turning those old tires into big soft balloons that would spread his weight across the mud instead of cutting down through it. Some of the watching farmers shook their heads. They said, "You couldn't get the traction with tires that soft." Raymond didn't argue. He just hooked his chain to Tom's tractor and put his Farmall in low gear. The Farmall M weighed about 5,000 pounds. Maybe a third of what Tom's four-wheel drive weighed. It had 40 horsepower compared to the newer tractor's 130. On paper, there was no reason it should have been able to move that stuck machine. But Raymond understood something most of the others had forgotten. It wasn't about horsepower. It wasn't about weight. It was about contact area and steady pressure and not fighting the ground. The Farmall's soft tires floated on top of the mud, where the newer tractor's hard, aggressive tread had cut straight down to the clay. Raymond eased the throttle forward, kept the engine at a steady 1500 RPM, and let the old tractor pull. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, incrementally, Tom's four-wheel drive started to move. Not fast, not dramatically. Just a steady, patient extraction, inch by inch, until the big machine was sitting on firmer ground and Tom was standing there with his mouth open. The crowd went quiet. Then someone asked if Raymond could get the combine out too. Raymond looked at it, looked at his tractor, and said he'd try. He repositioned, hooked his chain to a different point on the combine's frame, let a little more air out of his tires, and pulled again. Same process, same steady pressure, same patient extraction. 15 minutes later, the combine was out. Raymond disconnected his chain, drove his Farmall back to the road, stopped to air up his tires, and went home. He didn't stay to talk. He didn't wait for thanks. He just did the work and left. The story spread faster than the original stock tractors had. By the end of the week, Raymond Kessler's name was being mentioned at every coffee shop and feed mill in 3 counties. The man with the old Farmall that nobody respected had pulled out machines worth 40 times what his tractor was worth. The jokes stopped. The comments about Raymond being behind the times stopped. What replaced them was something quieter, something that sounded almost like respect, but underneath it was a question nobody wanted to ask out loud. If Raymond's old equipment could do that, what did that say about all the new equipment everyone else had bought? Corn prices peaked in June of 1973 at $3.20 a bushel. It felt like the beginning of a golden age. Farmers who'd managed to get their crops planted, even late, were calculating profits they'd never seen before. The ones heavily in debt were calculating how fast they could pay it down. The ones who weren't in debt were calculating how much more land they could buy. It seemed like the risk had paid off. It seemed like borrowing and expanding and betting on the future had been the right move all along. Raymond planted his 480 acres with his Farmall M and his old planter. Spent less than $800 on repairs that entire season. He harvested 128 bushels per acre that fall, right about average for his soil type, and sold his corn for $2.90 a bushel. After expenses, he cleared about $42,000. He put $38,000 of it in the bank. Then 1974 arrived, and the world changed. Corn prices started falling in January. By spring, they were down to $2.40. By summer, $2.10. By fall, they were back under $2 a bushel, and they kept falling. The oil embargo hit. Fuel prices tripled. Fertilizer prices doubled. Interest rates started climbing as inflation tore through the economy. The Federal Reserve, trying to control runaway price increases, pushed rates higher and higher. By 1975, the prime rate was 5%. By 1979, 75%. By 1980, it would hit 5%, the highest in American history. Farmers who'd borrowed heavily in the early 70s found themselves trapped. Their revenue was falling while their costs were rising and their debt service was exploding. The land they bought for $470 an acre was suddenly worth $300, then $250, then less. They couldn't sell without taking massive losses. They couldn't refinance because the banks were tightening credit. They couldn't cut costs because they'd already committed to equipment payments and land payments and operating loans. Tom Hoffetter lasted until 1977. He sold everything at auction on a cold March morning, standing in his own farmyard while strangers beat on his life's work. The four-wheel drive tractor that had gotten stuck in the mud went for $6,000, a third of what Tom had paid for it. The land went back to the bank. Tom moved to Champaign and took a job at a tire factory. He was 38 years old. He never farmed again. He wasn't alone. Across the Midwest, farms that had been in families for 3 or 4 generations were disappearing. The 80s would be even worse, with farm foreclosures hitting levels not seen since the Great Depression. But the seeds of that crisis were planted in the early 70s, when everyone believed that prices would keep rising and that debt was just a tool for building wealth. Raymond kept farming. He bought Tom's land at the bank auction for $290 an acre, paying cash, bringing his total operation to 680 acres. He still ran the Farmall M. In 1979, the transmission finally gave out, and Raymond spent 3 weeks rebuilding it in his shed, using parts he ordered from a catalog and skills he'd learned from his father. The tractor ran for another 12 years after that. Raymond didn't buy a new tractor until 1986, and when he did, he paid cash for a used machine and kept the Farmall M in the shed just in case. By the time Raymond retired in 1994 and handed the farm over to his son, he owned 920 acres outright, had over $400,000 in the bank, and had never missed a loan payment because he'd never taken a loan. The story of Raymond Kessler and his Farmall became something of a legend in that part of Illinois. People told it at farm shows and family reunions, usually with some embellishment about how many tractors Raymond had pulled out of the mud, or how old his equipment really was. But the core truth remained. A man with old equipment and no debt had outlasted men with new equipment and heavy borrowing. Not because the old equipment was better, it wasn't. Not because Raymond was smarter or worked harder. He probably wasn't and didn't. He outlasted them because he understood the difference between what you need and what you want, between what you can afford and what you can finance, between patience and opportunity. He understood that in farming, like in most things, the ones who survive aren't usually the ones who grow the fastest or spend the most or take the biggest risks. They're the ones who can weather the downturns, the ones who don't panic when prices fall, the ones who aren't forced to sell at the worst possible time because they owe money they can't repay. Raymond Kessler didn't have an economics degree. He probably couldn't have explained the relationship between monetary policy and commodity prices, but he knew in a deep and practical way that owing money made you vulnerable. It gave someone else power over your decisions. It forced you to optimize for the short term, to chase every marginal dollar, to keep rolling the dice even when the odds were turning against you. Being debt-free gave him options. It gave him time. It gave him the ability to wait for the right moment instead of being forced to act at the wrong one. When Tom Hofeter was stuck in the mud, desperately trying to get his crop planted so he could make his loan payments, Raymond was able to sit in his shed and wait for the ground to dry. That difference, that simple ability to wait, was worth more than any amount of horsepower or technology. Raymond's Farmall M represented a philosophy, a way of thinking about value and cost and risk that had become unfashionable by the 1970s but proved itself essential when the economy turned. It was the mechanical embodiment of living within your means, of prioritizing ownership over access, of choosing freedom from obligation over the appearance of success. Raymond wasn't morally superior to Tom Hofeter. He wasn't even necessarily wiser. He was luckier in some ways, having inherited land that was already paid off. And he was risk-averse in a way that could have worked against him if prices had kept climbing instead of falling. But here's the thing. Economic conditions are fundamentally unpredictable, and strategies that depend on everything going right are fragile in ways that only become apparent when something goes wrong. What Raymond had was resilience. His operation could survive bad years. It could survive low prices. It could survive high interest rates. It could survive all of those things happening at once, which is exactly what happened in the late 70s and early 80s. Tom's operation couldn't, not because Tom was foolish or reckless, but because his entire model was built on a set of assumptions about the future that turned out to be wrong. When those assumptions failed, he had no margin for error, no buffer, no way to absorb the shock. Raymond's margin for error was enormous because his fixed costs were so low. He could have grown half a crop and still covered his expenses. Tom needed everything to go perfectly just to break even. The pattern repeats. Every generation seems to rediscover the same lessons about debt and risk and the dangers of assuming that good times will last forever. The farm crisis of the 80s was followed by the savings and loan crisis, then the dot-com bubble, then the housing crisis of 2008, then the everything bubble of the 2020s. The details change, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. Easy credit encourages people to take on obligations they can't sustain. Asset prices rise as more money chases the same assets. People extrapolate recent trends into the future and make decisions based on those extrapolations. Then something shifts. Credit tightens. Prices fall. And everyone who was leveraged discovers that leverage works both ways. On the way up, it amplifies gains. On the way down, it amplifies losses. And when the losses get big enough, they become permanent. Raymond Kessler died in 2003 at the age of 79. His son still farms the land, now expanded to over 1,400 acres. And he still runs a Farmall M, though not the original one. That tractor sits in a machine shed, fully restored, a reminder of a time when the choices a man made about equipment carried implications that reached far beyond the fields. Visitors sometimes ask to see it, and Raymond's son shows them, tells them the story about the mud and the stuck tractors and his father's patient approach to pulling them out. He tells them about the farm crisis, about Tom Hoffeter, about all the neighbors who didn't make it through. And then he usually says something that his father used to say. The most expensive thing you can buy is something you can't afford, even if you can make the payments. Debt is still debt. Interest still compounds. Markets still cycle. The farmer who can survive low prices still has an advantage over the farmer who needs high prices to stay solvent. These are not exciting truths. They don't make for good marketing copy. They don't inspire visions of growth and expansion and building empires. But they're true. And they remain true regardless of how much technology advances or how sophisticated financial instruments become. There's always pressure to grow, to expand, to leverage every opportunity, to maximize every advantage. That pressure comes from peers, from culture, from the financial system itself, which profits from lending and therefore encourages borrowing. Resisting that pressure requires a kind of confidence that's hard to maintain when everyone around you seems to be getting ahead by doing the opposite of what you're doing. Raymond Kessler endured years of subtle mockery before his approach was vindicated. But here's the thing about that kind of courage. It's only visible in retrospect. At the time, it looks like caution or stubbornness or fear. Only later, after the crash, after the foreclosures, after the auctions and the bankruptcies, and the families losing everything, does it become clear that the cautious ones weren't afraid. They were prepared. Tom Hoffeter probably thought the chance of corn prices falling back under $2 was remote. He was wrong. Raymond Kessler probably thought it was likely enough to plan for. He was right. That difference determined everything that followed. So what does this mean for us now? It means that debt, no matter how cheap or how easily available, creates vulnerability. It means that the ability to weather downturns is more valuable than the ability to maximize gains during upturns. It means that what looks like an opportunity often carries hidden risks that only become visible when it's too late to avoid them. It means that sometimes the smartest move is to do nothing, to wait, to preserve optionality, to avoid committing yourself to a path that depends on things you can't control going exactly the way you hope they will. These aren't exciting principles. They won't make you rich quickly. They probably won't make you rich at all, but they might keep you from losing everything when the cycle turns. And in the long run, not losing everything is often more important than winning big. What would you have done in Raymond's position in 1968, standing in that dealership, looking at that new Farmall 656, knowing you could finance it at 4, 5%? Would you have walked away? Would you have bought it? Would you have been able to resist the appeal of progress, of efficiency, of having the same equipment your neighbors had? These aren't easy questions. The easy answer is to say that, of course, you would have done what Raymond did, because you can see how the story ends. But you wouldn't have seen that in 1968. Most people, given that choice, choose bigger. That's not weakness. That's not foolishness. That's human nature. The question is whether human nature, left to its own devices, is equipped to make good long-term economic decisions in a world of easy credit and uncertain futures. How do we protect ourselves from our own optimism? How do we build resilience into our lives and our businesses and our communities in a culture that celebrates risk-taking and growth and the endless pursuit of more? Those are the questions Raymond Kessler's story raises. They don't have simple answers. Maybe they don't have answers at all, but they're worth thinking about, worth wrestling with, worth keeping in mind the next time someone offers you a loan at a low rate to buy something you don't strictly need, because the mud is always there, waiting. And when you get stuck, the question won't be how powerful your tractor is. It will be whether you can get out before everything you've built sinks along with you. If this story made you think differently about debt, risk, and financial decisions, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your future self will thank you.